So if we perhaps we start with just a brief introduction from everybody. My name's Denise Weston. I'm a Broadheath Ward Councillor and I chair this Children and Young People Scrutiny Committee.
Jonathan Coop, Councillor for Flixton Ward.
Thomas Carey, the Councillor for Village Ward.
Karen Samples, Director of Education.
Atlanta Montague, Member of Trafford Youth Cabinet.
Mark Bailey, Advocacy and Engagement Officer, Trafford Council.
Cathy Rooney, Acting Director of Children's Services.
Dan Jerome, Councillor for Altrincham.
Graham Whittam, Councillor for Davyhulme West.
David Acton, Councillor for Gorse Hill.
Jane Dillon, Councillor for Davyhulme East.
I'm Adele New, I'm Councillor for Bucklow, St Martin's.
Amy White, Councillor for Broadheath.
Alex Murray, Democratic and Scrutiny Officer.
Fabiola Fuschi, Democratic and Scrutiny Officer.
We also have Glynis.
Hi, Glynis Williams, Acting Director of Safeguarding. Cathy Southern, Operations Manager from Adoption Camps. And Sue Westwood, Head of Services Adoption Camps.
Thank you. I've not received any apologies. I don't know if you have at all.
I've received apologies from John Riley and from Sadia Khan.
Okay, thank you. Are there any declarations of interest that we need to record? No? Okay.
I'm not certain whether or not I need to declare it, but I am a childminder. I'm a childcare provider and I also provide places for 2 to 3 year funding.
Okay.
So I'm just declaring that.
Thank you, Adele. And we know Tom's a teacher. Has everybody had a chance to look at the minutes of the previous meeting, and are we happy to accept them? Yeah. Okay. We've got a slight change to order on the agenda, so I'm going to ask Atlanta and Mark to give us a report on the Trafford Youth Parliament. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Okay, this is we've been asked to come and speak about the results of our annual Make Your Mark survey for Trafford children and young people. Well, young people, secondary school age. Atlanta is one of the candidates to be our new member of Youth Parliament, and if you come here tomorrow at the same time, you'll see a vote taking place and ballots being counted. So whoever wins that, one of their jobs will be to prioritise the top 10 issues that go onto the Make Your Mark ballot. That ballot is then sent out to as many schools as possible in Trafford to take part, and all the pupils in the school vote basically on what the most important issue is for them. So the election took place between August and October last year, and the top 5 issues you can see on. So this was the results for Trafford. It sort of mirrors some of the national results as well. So the number 1 issue was end knife crime. Number 2 was homelessness, equal pay, equal work, mental health, and transport. Since then, Youth Cabinet have done a lot of work on this in their meetings and have consulted with other young people at their annual Let's Talk conference, where schools are invited to bring pupils along. I'm going to be quiet now. So we've got a slide for each of the 5 issues. The top bit in red is what was actually on the ballot paper, so you can see exactly what was voted for. And then the other points are some of the things that the young people have come up with to think that possibly could be solutions to some of these issues. Is that okay? So I'll hand over to Atlanta now.
Yeah. So the first one is end knife crime. And as you can see in the red, it's quite a bold topic, especially now. is quite relevant. I think young people care about this so much as it is a quite serious, very serious topic that more people need to address it, as seen by these points that we have come up with as a cabinet, and we feel like these could be the steps towards ending knife crime. So the first one is more education at an early age about the issue. In terms of early age, I feel like as young people, I feel like we need to tackle the issue as in around about 11 years old. I feel like that is quite a young age, but if you tackle the issue now, then it won't be such a serious issue in the future. Yes, lack of services. I feel like there isn't enough, like young people feel like there isn't enough services for this type of issue. And those who are victims of knife crime, I feel like there isn't enough service for them to go to get some type of help. And the last point, it says more mindfulness and relationships education to prevent problems escalating to violence. I think what means by that is like assemblies, type of workshops, type of things to try and educate people in the most direct way possible for them to stop violence. And the next one is homelessness. I feel like as young people, we see homelessness every day, and it's not just the old people, it can be young people as well on the streets. And there is quite a lot of stigma around homelessness. Some people say that they can't bother getting jobs, or some people say that they are mentally ill, or those are quite the stereotypes that young people have heard. So, as well as stigma, we want to get as many young people off the streets as well. It says here, young people need to learn about homelessness, which includes the causes why people might stay on the streets. Main issues that could be the reason why people stay on the streets: they have nowhere else to go. They're too scared to go home. Like there could be many causes why people might stay on the streets, but we never know that. But people bring up a lot of stereotypes around it, which is obviously not the right way to approach the issue. We could approach the issue in many ways, as seen by the bullet points.
Right.
Yeah, next one. Equal pay, equal for equal work. Many young people feel like they are not treated right in their workplace because of the pay we receive. As young people, we feel like we are not seen enough in the workplace, as we have to pay. I think when you're 16, you have to pay the adult fare for a bus, but you are paid the wage of a child. But the hourly wage that we earn is like a day ticket for an adult, which is ridiculous. Encourage businesses to pay young people a fair wage. Some businesses do this, but not all businesses. Some businesses do pay £4.20 an hour. I feel like as young people, if we are doing the same work as someone who is 18 plus, I don't feel like there is a problem if we're not paid £4.20. If we're only paid £4.20 an hour, and those who do the same work, they get paid around like £7.83 an hour. I don't feel like that is kind of fair. Encourage all schools to give their students time for work experience. Young people who go to schools and colleges, they don't get enough work experience. So when they go out there and when they do try and approach someone for a job and they ask what work experience you have, they have to say, well, I haven't had any because we haven't had the time, or some people don't offer work experience. So I feel like if schools could approach that and try and get as much work experience as possible, then maybe we could get more work experience and lead to a better job. mental health. This has come up pretty much year after year after year to year, obviously, because it's a very massive topic that needs to be addressed more seriously, delicately, and more directly. All teachers need training on mental health. Yes, as young people, we feel like we can't talk to our teachers because we don't know how to talk to them, or when we do talk to them, they don't know how to approach us, which is not their fault at all. It's just that they haven't had the training on doing that. COOF, which is online website where young people can go to up to about 10 o'clock in the evening and talk anonymously to trained professionals and counsellors about their worries. That has been talked to with youth cabinet, and they have done multiple assemblies in schools, but we've just tried to promote that more to not just schools but community groups and colleges and all others who need mental health, like who need help with their mental health. We talk about more about mental health. Some young people may not talk about mental health, so I feel like we all should raise a conversation about it and continue the conversation, not just start conversation because there's a PowerPoint in school or because there's a workshop. Don't just stop the conversation there. Carry on and continue the conversation, and then it's reached to a wider audience, and then everyone can help each other with mental health because we all have a mental health. So either way, if it's good or bad, we all should help others. And the last one is transport. Trafford Youth Cabinet has done a lot of work on this recently, especially with the 16 to 18 opportunity pass, which the GMYCA have done, I believe. And that will be done in September, I believe, for 16 and 18 euros. So we get free buses, I believe. I believe it is called the Unity Pass. Our pass. Apologies. Live waiting time for buses. I know this is done in London, but it's not done in Manchester, which is unfortunate. So we're trying to push that as well. Make tram travel cheaper for young people. As young people, we have now seen the new system with the zones, with different types of zones, which has some ways made it more cheaper, but some ways has made it more expensive, especially those who are 16 plus, because we now have to pay the adult fare because we now don't have an IGO, which is kind of a bit because we are still young people, but we have to pay the adult fare, which is a bit, I don't know. And then with the trams and making sure they're safe, I believe that with young people, when they do approach tram and when they do get on a tram, especially at night, it's very, very unsafe with recent reports and incidents on the trams. So just ensure that the Met people, as people call it, to get on the tram and make sure it's more safe. Police outside the tram stopped, make sure it's safe for all young people. Safer bus stops as well. With young people, there's like people throw glass at the bus and people can be kind of insulted on the bus. So just make sure, again, people are more safe on the bus. Yeah.
And breathe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Atlanta. That was a really interesting presentation, and it's good for us older people to appreciate really the issues that do affect our young people. My children are all grown up, children of their own, but I worry. I've got grandchildren coming up, and I worry about them once they start to go out on their own. So yeah, I think you've raised some very, very interesting points there. So thank you for an excellent presentation. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Dave and then Dan.
Yeah, thanks very much for that excellent presentation. It was really, really good. Just on the knife crime, because obviously it's become a national debate. And in terms of when people have responded to the survey, have they said anything about actually seeing and experiencing people actually carrying knives, or is it, learnt from the media and so on? So I just wonder about people's experience, young people's experience.
I feel like it's kind of half and half. Some people have experienced it, and then some people have learned it off the media, especially now. So it depends on the person's situation.
Sorry, we did a workshop at the last conference, and we asked all the young people that were there. There must have been about 90 young people from a variety of Trafford schools, if they thought knife crime was a problem in Trafford as opposed to nationally. And I would say about half put their hands up and said, yeah, they thought it was a problem in Trafford. So I think that's sort of what we were looking at. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. That was really, really interesting, and 5 really important issues. I couldn't agree more with you about public transport and younger people getting cheaper fares, to encourage them to use public transport. But I kind of think that should go up to the age of 25 and maybe even older. But I was quite surprised that climate change is not one of the 5 issues. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, that is quite a good question. I'm surprised it's not up there now, especially with all the strikes, the youth strike for climate I've seen. I don't know why it's not up there, to be honest, because I feel like lots of young people do care about it a lot, but not a lot of people have voted for that. So I can't really answer that, but yeah.
What was it an option to vote for?
No, it didn't come in the top 10. That's why it wasn't on the ballot paper. Yeah, I was quite surprised as well. But whoever's NYP next year, maybe it'll be a priority for them. So we keep pushing it.
I just wanted to ask you about, because some of these issues are things that can be dealt with at a Greater Manchester level by Andy Burnham and the Combined Authority, and by Transport for Greater Manchester, for example, around some of the transport issues that you talked about. So just be interested to know a bit more about whether you are able to come together with other youth councils from across Greater Manchester to do joint work, and just understand a bit more about how that works. And then the other thing was just to sort of say about really sort of agree with you about the equal pay for younger people. It's scandalous that younger people are expected to do the same work for a lesser amount per hour, and very hard to justify, and not something that you see in other countries where there's a minimum wage in place. You don't tend to get such a lower rate for younger people as you do in this country. So we'd just really encourage you to contact the Living Wage campaign, who promote the real living wage, which applies to all people in employment. Those employers that adopt the living wage, they have to pay that flat rate or above to all workers, regardless of how old they are. So really encourage you to engage with that. But yeah, just interested to know about how things work across Greater Manchester with some of the other youth councils.
Well, we've got a couple of things. We've got a regional youth council, which is called Youthphoria. That's a northwest wide. So they meet every 2 months in different parts of the northwest. Next one's on Sunday in Lancaster, I believe. But Andy Burnham has set up the Greater Manchester Youth Combined Authority. Now that is it's got 40 members. So 20 members are 2 members from each of the 10 local authority youth councils. So we've got 2 members that have been voted onto that, and that they meet, I think, every month. And the other 20 members are from various voluntary sector organisations. So, for example, Gorse Hill Studios, which is one of our voluntary sector, they've got representatives on there. The Proud Trust that do our LGBT work, they've got 2 representatives as well, and various other community work. So they're doing a lot of the Greater Manchester level stuff, particularly around transport, and also a curriculum for life, which is ensuring that schools are educating young people around things that aren't just academic, but about how to get on with living when when you're becoming an adult, really. So there is quite a lot going on.
And have you found that the issues that young people have raised across Greater Manchester tend to be similar to the sort of top? I remember it was 5 issues here. There seem to be quite uniformity across each of the boroughs.
I think so. I mean, they're all different. Obviously, the different local authorities have got slight different totals. If you Google "Make Your Mark 2018," there's a report that gives you the results from every single local authority in the country. Oh, and for the first time, we got over 1 million young people voted for this. So I think in the version that you've got, it tells you what the top national issues were. Very similar to ours, maybe in a couple in a different order. But we actually got 1 million votes, which we were very proud of nationally.
I'm just really interested in what you were saying about COOF. I'm really interested in mental health issues, and I think it's really important, right from little children right the way up to adults, to be able to talk freely about how they feel. But I'd never actually heard of it. Can you tell me a little bit more about what COOF is and how we can access it, please? Because my daughter's 14, and as I say, no idea about it at all.
So what COOF does is you go on a website. I think it's just coof.co.uk or coof.com, not sure. But you go on there and you sign up. It's completely anonymous. You don't have to put your name in at all if you don't want to. And then they sign you up, and if you want to talk to someone, there's a button that says I want to talk to someone. It usually takes about 10 to 15 minutes until a counsellor comes to you, but they're really helpful. They ask like quite a lot of confidential questions. They ask if you're okay with it, if everything's all right, and before you get into the actual counselling. There are articles on there which young people do post about their personal experiences and do talk. There's like quite a lot of conversations on there about mental health. I'm not sure about the timing. I know it ends at 10 p.m, but I don't know what time counsellors are available. It is not a 24-hour thing. Oh, thank you.
If you go on the service directory for Trafford and just put in COOF, it's got all the details there. So it tells you when it's open. So there's counsellors online Monday to Friday, 12 p.m. It'll be 12 noon till 10 p.m. They're there Saturdays and Sundays as well. They're there every day, including Christmas Day. So they're always there. For 11 to 18-year-olds, as you say, mental health conditions, but it's you decide if you want to talk to them. So you don't have to have a diagnosed condition or anything. But it's all on the service directory as an available offer for our young people.
Can I just ask, is the service manned by volunteers, like sort of the Samaritans or Childline, or?
They're a company.
Oh, right,
They're
okay.
a business who run psychology services for adolescents.
Right, and it's
we
like
commissioned them.
Yeah, so it's like is it like a live chat thing, like a messenger forum? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Just in partly in response to Graham's point, really, I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there are some employers who don't behave like that, who do provide opportunities for young people, who do provide apprenticeships, and do make sure people are looked after and paid equally, regardless of their age. Sadly, as has been pointed out, there are also some employers who see young people coming and see them as an excuse to get work done for very little outlay. I think it would be very nice if there was some kind of system whereby employers, it was made clear to them statutorily what is expected of them, and that it is no longer acceptable to pay people basically a slave wage just because they happen to be under 18. So I think that's a very important piece of work, and I do agree it's something that should be looked into. Thank you.
Yeah, I do agree entirely with that. I know when my children were in the teens, they had Saturday jobs at sort of 16 to 18, and a lot of shops and local businesses got rid of them basically once they reached 18, and they'd take another 16-year-old on because it was cheaper. It's very, very unfair when you're standing for 8 hours a day, serving people in a shop or whatever, doing the same role as somebody who happens to be 20. You work just as hard, and I'm sure you've got much more energy than an older person anyway. So if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank you. Oh, sorry, John.
Just a comment, really. I'd just like to thank you for coming along and presenting. It's so important that we as councillors understand basically a lot about what you're thinking, what you feel that you're missing out on, and you've put that across very well tonight on the comments that you've made, and particularly about transport. I'm surprised, I've got to say, that youth facilities still comes up. I've seen that come up before at previous scrutinies when we've had people like yourself presenting to us that we're about to go forward for the Youth Parliament. Because I would say that there's probably more now available for the youth to do than there has been for such a long time. It's just broken down in so many ways, what with sport, amateur dramatics, which is something I do. There's so many things that people can engage with today, whereas when you mentioned us older people, when all we really had were youth clubs, and it's in my mind, unless I'm told differently, they're sort of not required anymore because there is so much diverse things for people to do and get engaged with, either through their schools, either after the hours of school. I think it's a case possibly of going out and looking for it, finding it and seeing what's out there. It could be anything. But that's just a comment that I find. I'm surprised that it keeps coming up when, as I say, there's so much out there for people to get engaged with these days. So thank you, but thank you so much for those comments. Thank you.
I think personally that there still is very much a call for youth clubs and for local youth clubs as well. I mean, it's been mentioned about issues with transport. I spent 10 years of my life ferrying children from one activity to the other. Not all parents are able to do that. And a lot of these activities, youth club was, I don't know, it used to be a few shillings in my day. For £1, you could sort of go, you could get a drink and a bag of crisps or whatever. And there was all sorts of things going on within the youth club, whether you wanted table tennis or basketball or, whatever. And there was always people there to help and advise, but the youth clubs used to be more local. And I think we have major issues with transport and with young people's safety. I use public transport all the time. There is an edge now when you use the Metrolink or you get on a bus. There is an element of, I'm not going to say fear, but there's just an edge. You're a bit more cautious than perhaps you would have been. And I can understand that parents wouldn't want to let young people out and about because they don't feel it's safe for them to travel alone. And as I say, not all parents are able to transport the children. But I do still think there is a call for youth clubs. So I don't know if I'm perhaps down with the youngsters again with that. But I mean, would you personally still think there's something to offer there?
Kind of half and half. I feel like there is there are some type of youth involvement, but it's only for a certain amount of time. So, for example, NCS, National Assistance Service, which I took part in, and quite a lot of young people took part in, but that's only for 16 to 18-year-olds, and it is not quite a lot of money, but it can be quite a lot of money for some people, and it is only for 4 weeks. But that does open so many doors for young people to take part in more stuff. Like, I know after NCS, I took part in their regional youth board, and then after that I took part in many other things because of NCS. But a lot of young people will not take part in that because they don't usually know about it, or it does cost quite a lot of money because the last 2 weeks you have to make your own transport there. So as you were saying, that the Metrolink and the buses, they aren't exactly cheap, so not a lot of young people do take involved. However, we do have Trafford Youth Cabinet, which is young people do take involved in that. There are kind of sports clubs within primary schools now that a lot of young people do get involved in. But I feel like with youth clubs, they're only for a specific type of age. So say 5 to about 11, that are relatively cheap. But then after that, I feel like lots of young people do not take involved. So say my age, do not take involved in sports clubs and stuff because it's just so much more expensive, or there's just not the availability for our age range because they usually do it to 5 to 11 or 11 to 14, because they feel like we wouldn't get involved in that. But I feel like quite a lot of people who are my age will get involved in that.
Sorry, Del, do you want to just ask one last question? And then
It's not specifically a question, it's an observation really, based upon the fact that our youth services have been cut just to the bone, particularly in places where I live in Partington. And also, they rely upon volunteers to actually staff these things. And also, as you were saying before about mental health and that kind of support, we just haven't got the people in places anymore that we did have. And, it does come down to money, and it does come down to the fact that, as you stated earlier, cost of transport and things like that, so there are things that children can access, that young people can access, but it's not accessible to everybody. So I just really wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Well, thank you ever so much for coming to join us. I wish you luck tomorrow. And we're looking at a future councillor or MP here, hopefully. But all the very best, and thank you again. Right. Is it Kathy or Karen going to? If you could just give us, obviously we've had the report and we've had a good look at it. So if you could just give us a quick overview of the report. And
yeah, Kathy did say there's a lot of slides here.
Yeah. So so I'm not going to dwell on where there's lots of information there.
Really what I wanted to do is kind of set the scene really, and that was just showing the current Trafford position in terms of school readiness, and particularly early years. And for me, I suppose it was, the conditions are right really to make sure our school readiness is effective. So really that's just the stats that sit behind that. I think the bottom bullet point though is quite important. We are trying to get as many graduate practitioners into certainly our private voluntary sector, and really kind of enhance the workforce development for our early years staff as well. And I think it's testament to our workforce development team actually that we've got over 1,000 practitioners that are accessing a programme of training every year. So that's a really positive place for Trafford. Really, this was again just to give you the overview of exactly what's measured when it comes to the early years outcomes and what the good level of development actually means. And those are the main areas, the key areas which define if a child by the end of early years has achieved a good level of development. And obviously there's a lot of sort of data that sits underneath that. We know that improving school readiness is obviously a priority across GM. So it is a Greater Manchester priority, but ultimately we know it's a big priority for us in Trafford. We do obviously have the Early Years Strategic Board, which is a multi-agency board. So we've got all kinds of stakeholders that sit on that board, from education, from early years, from certainly our early years settings, PVIs, etc., as well as social care, the voluntary sector, and local authority officers. So, we feel we've got a good range of stakeholders that sit around the board. And we're overseeing really the early years strategic plan. And those are the key priorities that drive forward our planning in terms of improving school readiness in Trafford. The first one is around integrated systems. And certainly this is where I suppose it's all about that early intervention. And this is what this priority is seeking to deliver on, really. Ensuring that we get the right early help support, particularly for those vulnerable children, vulnerable families, at the right time and in a timely way, so that we make sure that everything is delivered to give them the best possible outcomes. Obviously, we're looking at a targeted integrated review. Now, that pathway has been signed off, but we understand that health visitors are under review at the moment, so it's kind of delayed the rollout and the implementation of that. But the actual process has been signed off, so we look forward to seeing that rolled out. And I think we are looking at the rollout in our targeted areas of the North and Partington as well. The transition as well, I mean, that's just about making sure that we try and standardise transition processes from our nurseries into our schools and make sure the right kind of information is shared, again, particularly focusing on our vulnerable children and our vulnerable families, and making sure that we make sure those families that are entitled to pupil premium know they're eligible, and actually and schools and settings understand that eligibility, so we can get the funding in for those children. The special educational needs, I've talked about this, I think, at Scrutiny when we've looked at special educational needs across the board. But I think, again, it's just important to note that we recognise that our special educational needs early years children are not achieving as well as they should be. And again, we are making sure that we've firmed up all the different pathways of support for these children and families at an early stage. And I'll certainly talk more about the speech and language communication, because that's very much a prime area of need that we recognise is a barrier to those children becoming school ready. This really sits with health, and health helped to report back on this in terms of our strategic board. The actual speech, language and communication, as I just said, this is one of the main barriers to children achieving a good level of development. So it's been a real targeted effort in terms of workforce development, training, and making sure that we've got the right kind of support wrapped around these children and these families in a timely way. So we use the Welcome screening tool, and that's had a massive rollout now across Trafford. Again, this is down to the hard work of our workforce development team, and we've made sure that we've really targeted again our hotspot areas, the Partington and the North as well, particularly where we see that social communication and language development, speech and language is a barrier for those children. And the Welcome tool is a really useful tool, because it's not only about screening children and determining where the gaps are in terms of their language development, but it also gives a range of strategies then that can be utilised across the provision and the different settings. It's interesting, we've rolled it out and it has led to a bit of an increase, a spike in referrals to speech and language now, but we anticipated that was going to happen. And what we have done as a result of that is the early years team have employed a part-time speech and language therapist that will sit within the early years strategic team, and her role will very much be about making sure we embed this tool so it's used effectively to get the right kind of provision right for these children. So, hopefully that spike then will disappear as we get the provision right in the very early days. So yeah, that was just about why we choose to use Welcome. Again, what's great is if you have a look at our hotspot areas in the North and Partington, you can see that every PVI group, every private, voluntary and independent early years group setting has received 3 speech therapy visits since the project started, and now there are bespoke action plans in place for those settings. We talked, I think, at one of the last scrutinies about the parenting offer, and I think there was a question about what the parenting offer looks like in Trafford. So certainly what we're looking at now is a mapping out of that parenting offer to make sure we've not got any gaps. So certainly commissioning have been able to provide some really effective information about the various parenting strategies that are available. We do review those all of the time, because one of the difficulties we have is parents have to agree these parenting courses and support that's available to them, and not all of them complete them. So we're having to review what are the most effective, what have had the greatest impact with the greatest completion rates as well, to make sure that we're getting that offer. But we've got a mapped out offer which looks at the universal, which very often is achieved through health visiting, school nurses, again, Sure Start, some of the voluntary sector, what the targeted provision then needs to look like for where we perhaps need early help, and a more formalised approach and support for parenting, and then where there are perhaps more complex cases as well. So we've actually achieved a much more mapped out view now of the Trafford offer. One of the things that the Startwell board is looking at as well is those sort of attachment issues that may occur as well, particularly mental health needs in the antenatal period. And again, I think what we've identified at the Startwell board now is that the missing link has been those critical 1001 days. So that's from conception right till 2. The early years strategic board tends to deliver everything once a child enters some kind of setting or support with a private voluntary and independent or a childminder. But what we're missing is the mapping out of exactly what's gone on beforehand. So that's something, and I know across GM, across Greater Manchester, that's a big priority. That's something that we're looking to do now. The physical development pathway is something, again, that is a new priority for the early years strategic board. So we know that in certain localities that physical development is not where it should be for our children. What we need to understand is whether that's gross motor skills, and is that because children just aren't accessing outdoor play anymore? Is this because of where they live? Is this a locality issue? Or equally, some of the small fine motor skills, just being able to do their coats up, do a button up, all of those kind of things as well. So there's some pieces of work that's going on around that now. Sufficiency will always stay one of our priorities, because we just need to make sure that we've got sufficient places, sufficient provision, and that it's a high quality provision as well. I've talked about the 2 place-based plans in our hotspot areas, the North and Partington. We continue to do a lot of data analysis around the need that sits within those localities. And again, as I've said there, representatives from a range of agencies now sit around small task and finish groups that are delivering on action plans for those areas. So the Partington School Readiness Plan, a lot of that is looking at the early help, the availability for some of those vulnerable families. What we are seeing is that although we have a lot of take-up of some of the 2-year-old provisions, some of the very early years provision in Partington, we're not convinced that actually attendance once they've taken up those places is good enough. So we are doing a bit of work on, they've signed up to these places, but are they actually turning up and attending? Because if they're not, then they're obviously not accessing good quality provision. So there's a little bit of work that's going to go on in terms of that attendance analysis as well. And in the North, what's obviously, I suppose it's not new news really. 44% of children who aren't school ready in the North have English as an additional language. Now, what's interesting in Trafford is by the time they get to the end of primary at Key Stage 2, those children have actually achieved better than their peers. So they do catch up. But we recognise that this can be a barrier, particularly when they are in the early years. And again, sometimes children within certain cultures, some of those parents and communities like to keep them at home. Once they're actually into formal education, they really, really, advocate and make sure their children do it extremely well. So again, there's some learning for us to do about how we can support those families in those communities as well. And that's it. So I've tried to do a whistle-stop tour, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of information in there. Has anybody got any questions? Graham?
Yeah, mine was just questions around sort of the sufficiency bit, really, that you mentioned, just to understand a bit more. One was just a technical question, is around how you can have an above 100%
Yeah.
take-up rate.
I knew-
which I think I knew the answers to that one, so I've forgotten. So it'd be great if you could just fill me in again. And then there's just a question about take-up of the 3 hours offer for 3 and 4-year-olds, how that's going. And yeah, I'll let you answer those before I...
Yeah, I know, because it does seem, how can you be above 100%? Yeah, it's obviously a statistical thing. We are a net importer as well, and I think that sort of affects our figures too. In terms of the 3 and 4-year-old take-up again, I mean, certainly, you know, again, our sort of statistics rate very highly. We do have that high take-up. The issue is, it's just maintaining that attendance once they've taken up those places.
So just on it, because there's a lot of, so obviously like the increase in support that parents have been able to get towards childcare over recent years has been, you know, welcome, but providers have talked about how the sort of per hour funding they get from central government for the 3 hours doesn't always cover the cost of delivery, and quite a lot of sort of discussion about smaller providers, private nurseries who might have been in the sector for decades, either sort of selling up to a chain or just closing up. I know that has happened in different parts of the country. So just be interested to know whether we're seeing that happening in Trafford, i.e. settings closing or a greater growth of chains as opposed to small providers.
We're not aware of many closures. We have an annual visit with Ofsted to talk about early years and specifically the sufficiency and the provision that's available in Trafford. The point, though, about the funding has been raised at Early Years Board, and I know Councillor Ball was taking up that conversation. Yeah.
There's just a number of points that I want to raise. Obviously, it's critical that we have, you know, all children ready for school, and I think when you've gone through the report and I've read the report, I think there's a lot of good stuff there. Obviously, we start probably in an improved situation than the national average, you know, but we still have 25% who are not school ready, and I think that is a lot of children. It's how we capture all of those, and I know you've done a lot of work in terms of doing that, and the fact that you know, you've got these the North locality in Partington, I think is crucial, but there are other pockets of deprivation around the borough, and it's how we actually get into the heart of those areas as well. So there's that, but what is also critical is what you've touched on in terms of the work with the families, and I think you know, there are vulnerable families out there, and there are you know, breakdown. I mean, how do you break down that cycle of behaviour, and how do you break down where parents will not work with us, because that again is something that does happen, and I don't know how you actually overcome that, but I think it's something that we need to understand how you're tackling that issue. So, you know, it's whether we've got enough resources and enough support mechanisms and support people to actually overcome all the difficulties that you're going to encounter as we move through.
Which I think where this mapping of the 1,001 critical days, as well as, you know, our current offer is probably going to help to identify exactly what's accessible to these families, and where the gaps are, and that, you know, that will probably help to inform any decision making that needs to happen, certainly in the early days. I mean, with the other schools and settings, basically we do challenge, certainly schools anyway, every school across the, you know, across Trafford with regard to early years data. We monitor every school. So the significance of the data, yes, is definitely identified in our hotspots, but there is challenge for all schools in terms of the impact of their spending for those disadvantaged children in early years. And actually, when we look at the numbers, there was an early years leads meeting quite recently, and I spoke to the early years leads, and certainly the data was presented to them. And actually, when it comes to numbers, we kind of left them with the message of, we probably only need about 12 more children to get a good level of development for us to get those children back up to where they should be. It's achievable, it's doable, it's about being aspirational as well for these children. And we are looking as well at using the teaching schools to really improve the current provision as well within our settings, to make sure that all of the children, whatever their situation, are experiencing high quality provision. So it's not only sort of, those targeted interventions, it's making sure that the whole experience is right for those children consistently across the patch.
But that doesn't really explain with the families.
Oh yeah, exactly. It is. You're absolutely right.
That will not
engage.
Because schools can do so much
they
for
can,
the children.
They can, and settings as well.
But if they don't have that support from the parents and families, and and there will be reasons around
absolutely
that. But it's how you overcome.
It is. I know. Look, the relationships are good. Relationships are strong. Between our providers and families, we can signpost, but we can't actually. It's very difficult to persuade them to actually take part and embrace some of the support that's there. I suppose it's just making sure that we've got the right services accessible to those people. To work hard at signposting and then supporting them, enabling them to see that that this really will support their families and their children. But it is very difficult to make them take these offers up.
Yeah, I just want to sort of carry on with what Dave said, but in an observational way. I work in Partington. I look after a lot of young children. I see a lot of children who come to me on 2 and 3 year funded places, 2-year-olds particularly, that I would never see if it wasn't for the funding. We have generations of the same families with the same parenting skills, the same suspicions of social services, the same concern, the same worry. If I was to approach somebody in a way that could cause offence about something that they're not doing on purpose, they would simply take the child out of the setting. It's only because I've lived in that community for decades where I could then go, if not to the parent, I could go to the grandparent and things like that. And it is really concerning that, we kind of, children have to be school ready by a certain age. When children leave me and go to nursery, they've overcome so much. Sometimes they're not socialised, they've not been out of the houses. I've got little ones who come in and they've never known anything but a dummy in the mouth, which is why they're not communicating. I had a mum come to me just a few months ago and said, I want him to have a place here. I've been told that you're referring for speech and language. I said, no, the first thing we'll do is take his dummy out. He couldn't speak. He's speaking from the back of his mouth. But it's all too common. And, I do believe that particularly in Partington, it's because it's the generations. We don't get people moving the same, as in other areas. And it's passed on and passed on, and there's so much work to do. But as you say, it is possible, but we've just got to make people so aware well. And when they go to school, rather than point out what children can't do, we need to be pointing out the strength of what they can do.
Absolutely.
Because that also puts a lot of parents off.
Yeah,
it
is. Yeah, learning how to celebrate their strengths and identify those strengths and tap into that as a way of building those relationships, really, and that trust. And I think it does go back to, the position of health visitors, because, a lot of settings will say they are the first port of call for these families. And so the more that possibly we can do by strengthening that service to start getting those messages and kind of building the trust, trying to create some aspiration as well in that family, I think is critical. And certainly this is what we've identified through Startwell Board as well. Yeah.
Thanks.
Could I ask, are there any restrictions on a 2-year-old child who is disabled having the free early education?
I'm not sure about that. I can find that out for you, but I'm not sure whether there's. Is that something that you've heard or?
Well, something
possibly something to investigate. Yeah, I can certainly look into that for you. Yeah.
Thank you. Speech and language pathway. Nothing, absolutely nothing is more important than speech and language. I'm entering my 8th decade on the planet, and I'm still struggling with language and speech at some times, or it may not show. How long does this pathway last? How long do you provide support and encouragement for the horrific story that you've just told about the 2-year-old who couldn't talk? You know, my parenting skills are rubbish, and my children would tell you that. But I was losing arguments with my kids when they were 2. No, I'm losing arguments with everybody nowadays. So how long does this pathway go on in order to get these people up to a good level?
Yeah. So the welcome, I mean, basically once they've completed the screening check, then a referral could be made. But there is an expectation that following the screening, there will be some interventions. So part of the screening check, there is a toolkit of resource then that can be utilised within the setting, because you've obviously got to give time for an intervention to have impact. So that's probably roughly about 6 weeks. And then obviously depending on the outcome of that may lead then to a more formalised speech and language pathway. Obviously the speech and language team, they have timescales that they have to work to. And you know, certainly the evidence from a special educational needs perspective is that they're coming in on time now. We are providing a lot of training as well for certainly support assistants throughout school, really, not just in early years as well, to be able to support and deliver where children and families can't get access to a speech and language therapist. Maybe they're just not quite hitting the mark, if you like, on the pathway. So you know, there are various options that are around, but you know, it's what we're trying to do is put the intervention in and then hopefully remove them from the pathway. But we just need to get the screening right, identify the need right, put in the interventions to see if they have impact, and then more targeted focus work from a speech and language therapist if required.
Just one last.
Sorry, it's a very quick one. It's a supplementary. We're getting into language now. As this pathway goes on and the years gently roll by, do the expectations of the team who are working with these children change? In other words, are they looking for a lower level of outcome with a 3 or 4-year-old than they are with a 6 or 7-year-old?
If you're talking about speech and language therapists, yeah, because you know, they'll obviously be assessing them and they'll be coming out with a particular age that they deem the child to be assessed at, regardless of the chronological age. There'll be an age that, you know, has been ascertained really by the assessments that are taking place. And then obviously programs of support and intervention are put in place for these children. But at the end of the day, we just want to make sure we address it as early as we possibly can. And I do believe it is through health visitors, through basic, you know, you've got basic parenting about, you know, take the dummy out, talk to the child, you know, all of those pieces of work. And then clearly if there are identified problems, we've got the welcome tool that can then support in the early years settings, which hopefully will mitigate the problem later on then. But I mean, I can probably, if you wish, provide more detail on what the actual pathway for speech and language looks like, if that's going to be helpful in terms of timescales, expectations, what the milestones are during the pathway, if that would be useful to you.
I think that would be very useful to us. Just have one last question from Dan.
How good have you been at identifying and dealing with autism in early years?
How long?
How good have you been good at identifying and dealing with autism in early years?
Yeah, I think certainly the early years team use our educational psychologists now to support settings in terms of getting the provision right. We do have autism specialists within the team, again, who work within early years, not just across schools. And those people have been in place for a number of years. Obviously, the pathway has just been revisited as well. And certainly, the actual early years sort of special needs toolkit for support, if you like, there's been a workshop held on that quite recently, I believe, and that will continue to be rolled out as well. So, and that's all about how to assess, plan, do, review, really, just making sure that you've got the environment right for these young children as well. But those consultants have been around for a long time. But I do know that the workforce development are looking for our educational psychologists to roll out training to support the settings. So it's perhaps a little bit more focused.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. You're more than welcome to stay if you wish, or feel free to leave. Enjoy. Okay. Can we move on to agenda item 6? And we have Kathy and Sue, if I've remembered the right names correctly, going to speak about adoption to us.
Good evening. I'm the head of Service of Adoption Counts, the regional adoption agency that covers and provides services in adoption, working with Trafford. Just to give you a little bit of history about regionalising adoption, obviously until May 2015, Trafford had its own adoption agency sited within the local authority. And in May 2015, the government announced, quite out of the blue really, a change in policy whereby they expected that all adoption services would need to be delivered on a regional agency by 2020. And I think that was based on a belief that bringing together small single local authority services into a bigger regional agency would increase the number of children adopted, reduce the length of time children waited to be adopted, because there was a belief that agencies only looked internally at their own families for children waiting, and that caused delay before they looked nationally or regionally. That it would offer the chance to improve post-adoption support services to families who've adopted, and that it would reduce, I think this was really critical, and their belief was that it would reduce, by reducing the number of adoption agencies, it would improve efficiency and effectiveness. So in essence, you would go from having around about 154 local authority adoption services to having 25 or 26 regional agencies, and having a strategic leadership then that sat with 26 people rather than 154 managers managing bits of adoption. Trafford had a long history of working with Stockport, Cheshire East, Tameside in a collaborative adoption arrangement called Fall for Adoption, and that had been very, very successful. And I think that formed the basis then of some discussions between May and September 15 around which agencies would join together and put in a bid. The government invited bids from local authorities to become regional agencies by September 15. So piece of work went on over that summer, and Trafford, Stockport, Cheshire East, Salford and Manchester eventually agreed to put in a bid to become a regional agency. The government were quite surprised by the number of bids that they received, and by December of that year they'd accepted 19. So an awful lot of agencies were sort of set off on a pilot phase altogether. And I think with retrospect, the Department for Education would probably think that wasn't the best way to kind of transform services. By January 2016, Adoption Counts had its funding from the government over 2 years to become a regional agency. And we were very quickly, out of the 19 bids that went forward, we were quite quickly identified as one of 5 who were called demonstrator projects. So Adoption Counts was recognised as being one of the projects that had the most chance of succeeding in delivering a regional agency. Our aims that were developed in conjunction with our local authority partners were to provide children with the right adopters at the right time, approving those equipped to meet the needs of children waiting. I think agencies were approving at that stage a lot of adopters who were not necessarily equipped with the right skills. So it was a bit of a mismatch between adopters waiting and children waiting. To minimise changes of plan away from adoption, to try and make sure that the right children were identified at the right time, and that where we felt adoption was achievable, we did achieve that. To reduce delay and improve timescales, and critically, I think, to work with care planning processes in each council to make sure that we were identifying children who might need adoption at the very earliest stage, to twin track where there was still a possibility of rehabilitation home or a placement with a family member, to make sure that we kept an eye on those cases, and that if those plans didn't work, that we could then implement an adoption plan quickly and without delay. And we wanted to achieve best practice and consistency across the region. We had a range of authorities ranging from inadequate to outstanding, and we wanted to make sure that the very best practice came together. I think it was really critical that we recognised that one of the risks of regionalisation was that you would lift adoption out of a local authority and put it in a regional agency, whereas actually adoption is an integral part of care planning, and we worked very hard to make sure that we wouldn't become a separate, isolated agency. Adoption Counts is Trafford's agency. We're not somebody different or somebody separate. And I think we've got a model that really achieves that by making sure that for Trafford children, we have staff who spend part of the time within the regional agency, which is based largely in Wythenshawe, but also spends a lot of time in Trafford with the care planning teams, the legal teams, the managers, making sure that those relationships are really very strong. We wanted to improve early permanence planning, so identifying children very early and placing them with their potential adopters at the earliest stage, using concurrency and fostering for adoption. And to develop more innovative approaches to placing those children who we've called hard to place, or now tend to call children who wait longer, maybe children who are older, children who are members of larger sibling groups, children who have disabilities. And we wanted to use the skills and innovation and experience of those 5 local authorities coming together to try and place those children more quickly. And finally, to reduce the likelihood of breakdown through very good matching of children, good preparation of adopters, and adoption support. Adoption Counts has been given a grant for 2 years. We are one of only 2 regional adoption agencies to have £500,000 over 2 years to develop a centre of excellence for adoption support. So our children are provided, and families are provided, with a multi-agency early intervention prevention service by our adoption support service. In terms of working with Trafford, I think it's been really important, as it is with all our local authorities, to make sure that we embed that partnership and accountability at all levels. So at the top of the regional agency, we've got a strategic management board, whereby DCSs or assistant directors attend on a quarterly basis now. We did have a monthly meeting while the project was up and running, but since we went live in July 17, that's now reduced to quarterly. And I produce a performance report and a management report, and the board strategically scrutinises and monitors our performance. We have biannual meetings with all the local authorities. So in Trafford, we have a meeting whereby myself, Kathy, who is the operations manager linked to Trafford, meet with similar staff in Trafford to talk about what's working well, what we'd like to improve, how we can, overcome any problems, any barriers. On a 6 weekly basis, we have what's called the operations group. So within adoption camps, we have myself as head of service and then an operations manager who is linked strategically to be the lead for each local authority, and that's Kathy in relation to Trafford. And we've asked each local authority to identify a strategic link at the next level down from board member. And that's been Linda Crabtree from Trafford. And we meet 6 weekly to talk about some of the slightly more practical things. The board have a very strategic overview in terms of looking at the actual practicalities of how we work together. The operations group meets 6 weekly. We track with the local authority, we track every child from really kind of coming on the radar, children who might ultimately have a plan for adoption, but at this stage, social workers in Trafford are still looking at rehabilitation, they're still looking at family, friends, members, but we track those children until they come out of the sort of care planning system and go back home, or until their plan becomes very clearly one for adoption. That's done on a monthly basis, and we're monitoring what's happening to those children, what the care planning is, what our actions are in terms of family finding. It's a very robust system. And we've worked very hard, and Trafford staff have worked very hard to form really positive working relationships between managers and social workers through sharing best practice and learning, and really making sure that although the adoption team no longer sits within Trafford, that adoption counts as integrated as the team used to be when we sat here in the town hall. In terms of adoption performance, it's measured by what's called the adoption scorecard. The government brought this in way back in 2011, I think. And A1 measures the average time between children entering care and moving in with their adoptive family. And the government set a threshold. So the blue line on the top graph is the government threshold, and you'll see that that's been steadily decreasing until it's plateaued out at 426. And Trafford's performance has steadily come down in line with that threshold and expectation of performance. A2, the average time between the local authority getting court authority to place, so that's when a child's made subject to a placement order, and then the local authority making the decision that that child will be matched with an adoptive family. Again, the orange line shows how back in 2008-11, that was the threshold that the government expected to see was 213. It's now a much more challenging target of 121. And again, Trafford's performance has, from 2010, steadily come down slightly above that threshold. But if we then look at the national performance, you will see that for A1, the English average is 520 days, and Trafford's performance is very much at the higher end, at the best end of that performance. And the same with A2, the England average is 220 days. Again, the orange line represents Trafford's performance. So you can see that it's well within that highest performing quartile. And to date, for this year, one of Trafford's objectives has been to increase the numbers of children placed for adoption. But of course, that in any one year, the cohort of children, it's very flexible. For many children, it's absolutely right that they go back home or they go to family and friends members. And that's what any local authority would always try to do. But I think by working together in the public law outline system and at legal planning meetings, what we can be sure is that we are identifying those children who do need adoption. And you will see that this year, what's called an ADM decision, that's a decision that a child should be placed for adoption. There've been 15 to date. those children are in the court process and need to have a placement order before we can place them for adoption. But that's Trafford's decision for, in relation to those children. 6 placement orders have been granted to date this year. 7 children have been matched, 7 children placed with prospective adopters, and 4 adoption orders granted. So, they're not high numbers, but for those children, they are being placed with skilled adopters who've been very, well trained, supported, and prepared, and it's the right outcome for Trafford children. We've also circulated a much more detailed report about the adoption counts and its development so far, which I won't go through. We've picked out the highlights there, but quite happy to take any questions, and either Kathy or I will answer them.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have questions?
Hi, thank you for that. That's really interesting. Can I ask, once a child is adopted into a family, do they get any support ongoing?
Yes, they do. So we've developed a system of support whereby families are offered universal support. So families who are not necessarily experiencing any difficulties can attend a number of low-level universal support that's available. So they can come to coffee mornings, play groups, family fun days, picnics, those sorts of things. We also run a number of evening seminars, so things like how and when to tell your child they're adopted, how to deal with transitions from nursery to school, primary school to secondary school. They're delivered by psychologists or our staff. So any family can come to those. Then we have, for families who are experiencing sort of more difficulties, they can ask for an assessment at any stage, and we tier our help. So we've got families who need help, families who need more help, and then families who need specialist help. And we can access something called the Adoption Support Fund, which is a government set up fund for therapeutic intervention for children.
Thank you. A phrase that came up on several occasions, the hard to place. Could you give us an idea of what sort of issues make a child hard to place? Yeah. And following on from that, having placed them, how many are sent back? How many of this wonderfully professional adoption process fail and cause the whole process to have to be started again?
So children who wait longer traditionally tend to be older children over 4, particularly boys. Sibling groups of 2 or more. We have a number of sibling groups of 3 and 4 that we try to place for adoption. Children with any sort of disability tend to wait longer. And in terms of how we try to find families for those children, we use all sorts of methods. And Kathy recently ran an activity day where we invite families who are approved adopters to come to almost a sort of a picnic or a party or a fancy dress event, and foster carers bring the children, and adopters can actually see the children in real life, which brings to life, the fact that a sibling group of 3 might suddenly not look quite so scary as you thought. So we have adopters with what we call stretch, really, too. They might have thought about 2 children, and then they see 3 children and think, do you know what, I think I can do that. Adopters might think that they can only take up to 3, a 3-year-old, and then they see a 4-year-old and think, do you know what, that's still quite a young, small child, and actually they're not quite as scary as we thought. So we talk to our adoptive families around the sorts of children waiting. We present real profiles of children, and we also search nationally if we haven't got families who can take our children. We place about 80% of children with families that we've approved, and 20% of children with adoption agencies elsewhere who might have managed to recruit a family, for example, who will take a child with cerebral palsy, and we haven't got that sort of specialist family available. Very few adoptions break down. Kathy, have you got the figures for Trafford? I don't think we've had a disruption in Trafford since we've been in the regional adoption agency. So very few adoptions actually break down, and they're not necessarily the children who wait longest. You know, sometimes it's what looked like maybe should be a very straightforward placement, but things go wrong further down the line. It's quite hard to predict, really, around. If you look at children who disrupt, there's very little difference between them and children who actually stay within their families. I think probably what research would suggest is it's about the attitude and ability of the adopters to deal with some of the behaviours that might come with adoption.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation and the report, which I think is really helpful. Just in terms of elected members being involved in the whole process, because obviously one of our responsibilities is corporate parenting, and I think we all take that very seriously. Within the report, it doesn't say how members, elected members, are included in, such things as performance management of the service, and obviously that to me would be, something really important that members can actually do. To look at how the performance is going on throughout the year. And the other point that I just wanted to raise was on page 16, the recruitment and assessment for prospective adopters. And obviously we were looking at predicting over 100 families this last year, and not reach that target, and obviously there will be reasons around that. But I would be interested to understand the whole, and maybe not for tonight, but the whole recruitment assessment processes and how many we have, on the book, so to speak, that are ready for adopting. Because obviously the more that we can have, and the more that don't drop out and so on, the better. Obviously you have to go through a process to do that. It's just those 2 points really.
Yeah. I have been to Corporate Parent Working Party, I think twice in Trafford so far, to report on a regular basis around performance. And
sorry, that of course is chaired by Councillor Ball, and we've got Councillor Wetton there as well and others. So we do monitor the progress, but also when we have our monthly portfolio holder meeting with Councillor Ball, because Glynis actually sits on the board for the Regional Adoption Agency, she's able to then to report back on the performance. So the councillors are involved in it to a point.
Yeah. I wasn't sure whether
Could I just ask, children or young people who are adopted are still eligible for the Pupil Premium Plus. How can we as governors of schools ensure that those particular children or young people are actually benefiting from that allowance rather than it going into the school pot?
The virtual school heads have now been given a new statutory responsibility around previously looked after children, which includes adoption. And so obviously their overview of how that money is being spent is important. I think it is an issue about sometimes the money does go into a general pot, and parents sometimes make representation about that, and that they're not fully clear what benefit their child is getting. But I think the new statutory responsibility on the virtual school heads will help that.
Could I just go back to the question that you'd asked about recruitment? Because I guess it's important to understand that although we were predicting 117, I think at one point, families to be approved in this financial year, that sort of assumes that everything runs very smoothly, and the assessment process comprises of 2 stages. The first is 8 weeks, the second is 16. And so the families that haven't been approved or aren't going to be approved in this financial year aren't necessarily those who have withdrawn from the process, although around 10 have, for reasons that are right for them and their family. There are a number of families who are still in the process, just that won't be approved in this financial year. So perhaps might be at adoption panels in April or May next year, because either they've elected to take a break between stage 1 and stage 2. Sometimes people decide that they need to move house for reasons that completely baffle me. Sometimes people decide that they need to build an extension or have their kitchen refurbished. Sometimes, sadly, circumstances in families mean that perhaps they've had a bereavement and so need a longer period of time to resolve that loss before we feel they can go forward. At this present moment in time, I think we've got 38 families who are approved and waiting for children, although families are being matched very quickly, because we have a monthly strategic matching meeting that looks at the families who are coming through the process or who are approved and waiting, as well as the children who are subject to placement orders or those agency decisions. So we don't have any avoidable delay in the process for children, so we can make those matches and progress them very quickly as families are approved. And I think we have around 68 families who are in the process at the moment, who hopefully will become approved adoptive families for our children in the next financial year.
Yeah, mine was just a couple of questions. One really about that it was really interesting to get the policy background and understanding full sort of the move towards a regional adoption agency. Obviously the 5 boroughs have the reasons to come together as those 5 boroughs, etc. But just interested, I know the emphasis has been to central government policy and local authorities. Emphasis has been on sort of placing children and placing them quicker. But I just wonder whether I noticed on page 18 you talked about a recent survey that have been done, and I wonder whether that allows you to understand whether the experience for parents, adoptive parents, has changed since the move to the regional adoption agency.
I think a lot. We will continue to do the survey on an annual basis, I think, because a lot of the people were reflecting on experiences that were historical before the regional adoption agency was launched. I think one of the things we have been able to understand is that people, although they feel very satisfied with the adoption support service they receive once they have a service, they have been a bit frustrated by the kind of waiting list that we had when we went live. So we inherited more adoption support work than we thought, and that meant that we've had long waiting lists. And we also then, I think with any major transition in a service, the danger is some staff leave, and we've had a 49% turnover of staff in the first year. Now that's now very settled, and it was right that some people left if the regionalisation wasn't for them and they weren't able to buy into the aims and objectives that we had. But I think the combination of staffing vacancies and adoption support and much higher levels of need, that the survey has reflected that people have felt frustrated by the delay in getting through the door. Now, Trafford had 18 adoptive families waiting for support and 6 adopted adults waiting to access their birth records. We've implemented a triage and duty system, and all of those people have now been seen and have had a clinic appointment, which is something we've brought in to try and address that backlog. Hopefully, I think that next year when we redo the survey, that should reflect much more positively.
And just a quick question about the you mentioned 500,000 for a centre of excellence for 2 years. Is that 500,000 with a view to there being more funding available in the future?
Sorry, could you just say that?
You mentioned £500,000 over 2 years for
Yes.
centre of excellence. Is that with a view to there being more funding for that to continue in the future, or is that not something you're aware of yet?
So the £500,000 ends in July of this year. We're working with the Department for Education to see if we can get another 12 months funding, because 2 years is a very short period of time to really evidence the outcomes of what we think is a really robust early intervention prevention service. We're also working with our board partners around what it might cost to sustain that model if we don't get any more funding. And we're working with health to look at whether they would be able to contribute, because we believe that we are preventing a lot of young people and families needing to access things like core CAMs by providing a much earlier, much more low-level service. So we've got plans to try and sustain that beyond the grant funding.
Briefly, in response to Linda's point, schools, of course, and presumably this will include the virtual schools, I gather it's got a governing body, do have an obligation to evidence that pupil premium funding is not being just channeled into a big general pot. And I know, as someone with a vast and weary experience of Ofsted inspections, that is something they go into in some detail. So it is, whilst it's incumbent on us to check, schools do need to be demonstrating that, I think, and I'm sure Trafford's department will go into that in some detail too.
I think you were struggling to hear. It's very quietly spoken. It's Councillor Chilton. So I think it was just a bit of clarification that the extra funding would not just go into a school's general pot and would actually be spent on these children that've got the Premium Plus. Yeah. Okay. One last question, Dan.
Yeah. What kind of experience are the children having while they're waiting to be placed?
Children are almost 100% placed within foster care. So most children waiting to be placed, I think, are in very high quality foster care, usually provided by the local authority, because most young children are placed within local authority resources. So the vast majority of our children are moving to adoption from a very secure attached base within foster care, where social workers in Trafford are working with them to prepare them for adoption and make sure that they're ready to move into their new family.
Thank you. That was very interesting, very informative. As previously, you're more than welcome to stay for a little while for the next item, or you're free to leave. It's very late night for you. Thank you. And if we can move on to the penultimate item, I'm going to invite Glynis to give us, and I believe it's a verbal presentation, is it? Yeah. And it's a child protection plan update. Thank you.
Thank you. So you may recall that I came probably 4 months ago to give you the position with regard to repeat child protection plans. So you'll recall this is where children are subject to a second or subsequent child protection plan. what I've got for you is a broad update. I would say that there's still work for us to do. I think 4 months is a short period of time when we're looking at systems and wanting to, gain some improvement around this area. The actual figure remains the same. I think we reported 4 months ago, the figure was around 28% of repeat child protection plans, and that figure remains the same. We have continued with a very robust action plan around this area, and we are achieving all of the milestones on that plan. In particular, we've done some really strong work around our offer for older young people, so that will be teenagers. And in fact, we've implemented a programme launched on the 20th of January called ACT. And that's a real opportunity to work with vulnerable young people in a different way, where they're in control of their plans, and we work very closely with them around their ambitions. And so for that group, where there have been child protection concerns, there's a real opportunity to work in a different way alongside those young people and make a system that's better for those young people. We've now had restorative conferences in place for 6 months. Literally, the evaluation is just due now. We really wanted to wait till we had a good, strong period of 6 months. So in some ways, this is probably not the best timing. We also had, as part of our sector-led improvement, a peer review that was actually due a couple of weeks ago. And so that meant we had external partners, I suppose, coming into the local authority to support us and take a deep dive look with us. Unfortunately, we had to cancel that because we had an Ofsted inspection, but we will reschedule that because that's going to give us some really rich learning around this area of focus for us. This is a priority area for us, and we are continuing to strengthen our child in need offer. And in fact, we have a dedicated team that will be working with our children where they are children in need, and that will be launched over the coming months, and that will really support our step down from child protection plans to child in need, so that they don't bounce back into a child protection plan. So I think probably what I'm saying to you in summary is that we have some good plans in place. It remains our priority focus for us, but I need to come back probably at a later stage to really show you the I'm hoping, more positive outcomes and a difference.
Okay, that's super. Thank you, Glynis. Does anybody have any questions? No? No. Well, that was short and sweet. It was a long wait for shortest, but thank you for coming to see us, and it's much appreciated. And again, you're welcome to stay or leave us as you wish. Okay, if we move on to the final item, if you will remember, we formed a task and finish group to look at the SEN provision in Trafford, or SEND provision, I should say. It's been a huge topic to look at, and I think we all feel as a task and finish group that we've barely broken the ice in some cases. What we've tried to identify are areas where we think we can make a difference very quickly through just small changes, but we've also identified other areas where there's going to be a larger piece of work done, and more of a deep dive into them, to use the current terminology, which I've learned from here, deep dive. Yeah. I do apologise for the lateness of the paperwork on this. Poor Alex has had to cover 3 scrutiny committees over the last few months, and I know he's worked really hard on this, and I know a lot of it's been done in his own time. So I would like to express my thanks, and that is the Task and Finish group. I appreciate people won't have had a lot of time to read these papers, but if you want to bear with me, we can go through it step by step. I'm not going to present it because it's several pages long. I know. So basically, we decided to follow a similar approach to that taken by the previous review, which was gathering information from a meeting with senior officers. We also wanted to meet with parents, and we wanted to, at that meeting, make parents feel free to open up. I know some parents would perhaps be reluctant to talk or to speak openly in front of officers. So we asked, and the senior officers kindly agreed that they weren't present at the meeting. I think it was a very long meeting, and I do feel that parents were able to open up and discuss their own personal experiences. We had one parent that had a very good outcome, and one parent that his outcome wasn't quite so good and was a little bit unhappy. Following on from that, we have identified quite a few areas where that we could perhaps enhance or improve the service that we offer for our SEND children and their parents. One of the larger issues, or one of the big issues, seemed to be in communication, that parents are given details of who to contact for help and support from the very outset of an SEND referral, whether that's come from a school, from a doctor, or indeed from a parental referral. The signposting, and that the language, and John will like this one, not be using acronyms. Let's speak in plain language that people can understand, layman's terms, so that it's easily understandable for everybody. Information to be readily available as well. I think there was a perception that perhaps information wasn't readily offered and had to be requested. And in some cases, the signposting perhaps wasn't there. So just a simple thing, just to make people aware that, you know, that there is the Parents Forum that can offer help, to perhaps advertise that more. Another issue was with staff training, to make sure that our staff here, we were quite concerned that over a period of time there had been quite a big turnover of staff in the Children's Services Department, and particularly in the EHCP staffing. We need to look after our staff, basically, and ensure that their well-being, particularly due to the increasing demand on this service in general and the fluctuating workloads. And we need to ensure that they're always supported, and that they receive regular mentoring. I would imagine that for a member of staff, some of this can be quite emotive. You're dealing with parents and children with complex issues. It's going to be an emotional time for parents, and my concern was that the mental health of our EHCP staff could be adversely affected by that. I would imagine it's the sort of role, and I'm making an assumption here, where you can't help but take it home with you. As part of our ongoing work in that sphere, we'd asked, and we did get permission from Karen Samples, that we would do an anonymised survey to try and get a feel of how the staff were feeling. On the subject of staff as well, we believe that all the staff should have ongoing development and training, that they should all be, lost my list now, all be kept up to date with the legal requirements, in particular of the AHCP process. that all Senkos are also offered ongoing training, and not just the Senkos, but all staff in an educational setting from early years through. If we can identify issues early, then early intervention is always the best case for the child. Another thing we were looking at was outcomes. What happens if the outcome isn't satisfactory to the parent? How do we measure these outcomes? Who's accountable for these outcomes? Who basically do we go to if somebody's not happy with the outcome for their child? Every child's different, and I think we need to listen to the child as well. The parent knows the child better than anybody, but the voice of the child at the end of any decision, the child must be at the heart of it. And I think that's something that is perhaps difficult. You're dealing with great numbers of children. Every child is different. Every child will be a different case. And I think it's something that concerns me, particularly when workloads are heavy, that I think the child should be able to speak up. They should always be asked for their views. I think parents should be very much more involved in discussions concerning their own children. Also that teaching staff should be involved in these discussions to get everybody's view of a child. People see different elements of a child depending on how much time or what sort of time you spend with a child. You can get a child who is very well behaved, very quiet at school, but who in a home environment acts totally differently. And I think that's why we need a parent's view as well on this, as well as the experts and various different agencies that are involved. I'm trying to work through my list. Does anybody else from the Task and Finish group want to say anything before my voice gives out completely? Dan?
Yeah, just wanted to say that being a part of the Task and Finish group was an incredible journey, really. We met with Karen Samples and Gas, and got Trafford Council's kind of side of things. But then we moved on and we met with parents, and some of them were quite emotional and told us some real stories that had a massive impact. And then we went on to speak to the people that staff our services at Trafford Council, and again they were so welcoming and friendly and gave us so much insight. So I'd say that we have been on an incredible journey and learned so much. Many of us coming into it probably not knowing much about this area or subject. So I just wanted to say that Alex has been brilliant as well. That it's been a really incredible journey, and I think some really good things are going to come out of it, as Councillor Weston has told us.
Thank you. I think something else that came out of it is that we ensure that the council always operates in an open and transparent way, and that when asked for information, whether that be by members, parents or teaching staff, that information is readily given, published if that happens to be the case, and updated regularly. I think we owe it to our residents, to the public, and indeed to ourselves as members. We know how difficult it is sometimes that we request information and it's not readily available. So I think that would be something that would be one of our recommendations going forward. And also, one of the things we'd come up with was wondering if we were perhaps due an independent review. I believe the last one was done in 2012, just to see what changes that we could introduce to enhance or improve Trafford's SEND offer. I appreciate this will cost money, but at the end of the day, it may save money in the long term. So has anybody got any questions? Go Rob first.
Out of interest, were any foster carers approached, just because they have quite a unique perspective on this, because quite often not having more often than not custody of a child since birth, they don't necessarily have time to see the progression of symptoms of special educational needs. So they may suddenly be presented with a child who seems to have all the attributes of somebody without special educational needs, but suddenly it transpires they do. And I think that presents some quite unique challenges, certainly knowing some of them. So just be interested.
I agree, and I think that's perhaps something, and perhaps even for adopted parents as well, of having just had the presentation on adoption. That would be something we could perhaps look at in the future as well. John, did you have a question?
I wasn't part of this particular task and finish group. I am, however, and have been for many years, a governor at Brentwood School, which caters for the needs of severely challenged young people. I'm also a governor at Stretford Grammar School, a grammar school which has an SCN offer. If you carry on with this work, please, can we find a way of making the population out there aware that SEN is a huge spectrum of abilities, of needs, and that it is clearly targeted. The reason I wanted to ask this question is just to illustrate one thing that frightened me over the last couple of weeks, where I was approached by one of my residents with some help in a school placement. And she described the problems that her child had. And it was quite clear that she needed SEN support, clearly. But the parents had never sought that help and support because they were afraid of the child being stigmatized. And that's the other scale line of marketing, perhaps, that you can do, is to actually convince parents that this isn't a stigma. This is simply a slightly different way for some people and a massively different bypass for others to actually achieving what we're all in this business to do, which is to get our children and our young people to achieve the best they can.
Thank you, John. That was an that was an observation that we ourselves has made. Whereas, if your child is suddenly labelled as SEND, it's perhaps an attack on your parenting skills, or whether it would cause a defensiveness. And I think, like mental health, it's something that needs to be talked about. SEN could be something as simple as needing a bit of speech therapy. I mean, it's been a huge learning curve, I think, for all of us, and it's a fascinating subject. And the more we've sort of found out, the more you want to find out about it. But interesting point about the grammar schools, because on that high level of the spectrum, certainly it's brilliance as well, isn't it? That can just present itself in a very different way. What was that?
I think it's a really helpful report for us. I suppose, not having been through this before, I don't understand what happens next, if you like. There's clearly messages that be useful for us to, as a team and as a staff, to work through. You haven't had a chance to write up your recommendations, unless I've got an old version, I don't know. But I suppose that's my, I'm just thinking, it needs to go somewhere. We need to do something. I just don't quite know what the next stage is.
Okay, I'll go over its procedural matter. So the next stage is, well, the reason that the report doesn't have any recommendations is that I only finished it yesterday, which is my fault for underestimating how long it would take. And yeah, it is a very large area to look at. But anyway, as I only finished it yesterday, I can't put forward recommendations. They have to come from the committee, so it is for them to decide what recommendations are going to be. I was going to actually make a point that unless you can make the recommendations here today, I would recommend that the chair ask for the committee's permission that the task and finish group and the chair be given the power to make recommendations to go to the executive as part of the report. Therefore, it can go to the first meeting of the executive in the next year rather than having to come back to this committee to get the recommendations agreed before going to the executive. Once the recommendations are agreed, the next stage is to go to the executive. The executive will then ask the executive member, which will be probably Councillor Borough, to write a full response to all of the recommendations and to the report itself. That response will then come to the committee and will be delivered by Councillor Borough, so that the committee can ask further questions and hear what the councillor has to say. And from that, I think from this one, it'll probably be stages such as creating an action plan of how the recommendations that are accepted by the executive will be met, and the work that is going to be continued by the committee itself.
I didn't sit on the task and finish group, but obviously I've seen the report and I've managed to read most of it in the time that we've had, and I think it is a good report. And I think the suggestion from Alex that yourself, because you actually read out a number of sort of recommendations, really, and I think if you and Alex could put something together and then circulate it to the task and finish group for their approval, I would be, as a, not a member of the task and finish group, for that to happen.
Are the rest of the scrutiny committee happy for us to proceed in that manner? And obviously, you'd be copied in, wouldn't you, on the final report?
Yeah.
Is that correct, Alex? That we would copy the whole of the CYP scrutiny in?
Yes, we could even do agreement via email, but I didn't know whether you'd want to do it as a meeting but we can do it electronically if you would like, and that way all the committee can be involved.
Would that be acceptable to everybody? Yeah. Right. In that case, I don't think we've anything else. Are there any more items? Oh, sorry, Jane.
Just to say, I know it's not Alex's fault because it's just that I'm really struggling when we get our papers so late, and I'd just like to say, is there something that we can do to support Alex so that we can have access to the papers? It's just really difficult, especially people at work.
Yeah.
Just on that, it's literally just been the last couple of months since we've had issues with staffing within our department. That issue has now been resolved with the addition of Fabiola to our team, and so you should see a marked improvement in terms of receiving papers. Also, for this meeting in particular, due to the recent Ofsted inspection, there were a number of papers that came in late due to people prioritising that work instead. But you should see a marked improvement, and if you don't, then we're happy to contact us, and we will look into additional support if needed.
Okay, thank you. Any other urgent business? No. I'd just like to say thank you again to Alex. Welcome, Fabiola. I'm sure you'll get to know us all and be sick of the sight of us. But yeah. So with that, thank you all for coming, and I wish you all a safe journey home. Thank you.